As I mentioned in last week's video, personal personas embody an aspect to Carl Jung's specific take on psychology through the avenue of assigning the characters a myth to live as a parallel to their character. As this quote of his puts it, "The most important question that anyone can ask is, what myth am I living? The whole point of Jesus' life was not that we should become exactly like him, but that we should become ourselves in the same way that he became himself. Jesus was not the great exception, but the great example." End quote. And that is an important point because the initial personas represent the journey, while the ultimate personas represent the wholeness of the self that comes from said journey. The characters follow in the example of Jesus, to live as their truest selves, becoming psychologically divine, just as Jesus was at once the Son of and one with God in Christian mythology. This is why I wanted to do a separate list for the ultimate personas. The character arcs represented by the social links, the personal, intimate growth, give the characters new power, and the personas become closer to the divine, or are at least beings that are deified more so than the initial ones, who tend to be more human than the divine, even if they might be connected to the old gods as their children, descendants, believers, or allies. Much like the last list, this one will be operating without any real constraints. These are the 6 that I personally feel are the most fitting to be ultimate personas, irrespective of previous appearances. And so, without further ado, here are 6 potential ultimate personas for Persona 6. In my 6 demons from Shin Megami Tensei 5 to return in Persona 6 video, I brought up how Artemis's new design was a massive improvement over her previous one, and also in that video, I specifically brought attention to Demeter as a contrast, explaining why I felt that a similar philosophy of using modern sensibilities to represent Greek gods worked well for Artemis's design, and not so for Demeter's. Frankly speaking, just being a replacement for the horrible design as a persona would be an improvement to the representation of this goddess, and is enough of a reason to put her on this list by itself. I'm not being hyperbolic. Demeter is one of the most hated designs in the series for good reason. Doi-sensei designed her for Strange Journey to invoke a sense of ambiguity, so that her allegiance would be difficult to discern from a glance, but I and many others agree that a mischievous child failed to invoke what Doi-sensei had intended. But the major problems, even outside of that context, is the fact that Demeter's design does not suit her mythology, which is the same issue commonly taken with Amano Zako and Nua. Demeter in mythology is the goddess of the harvest, who is the mother of many lesser Greek gods, including those that have made appearances in the series before, like Persephone, and yet is portrayed as a lolly demon with a little girl's voice and childish mannerisms. By contrast to Demeter, Artemis is the goddess of femininity, and her design incorporates modern-day aspects of femininity with a magical girl aesthetic, a genre that often uses femininity as a source of inner strength and self-empowerment. One is an example of using modern aesthetics to complement the mythology of a design, and the other is a demon designed to invoke a modern aesthetic and arbitrarily given to a goddess who is in conflict with these ideas in mythology. This, I believe, is at the core for the contempt that this design provokes, and thus just having a better design will relax a lot of the animosity towards this mythological figure, and perhaps even open up the possibility for a better Demeter design in the future. However, that alone does not do justice for the reason to actually feature Demeter as an ultimate persona given her mythology. The goddess of the harvest, the bounty of the natural world, relating back to the confirmed color for Persona 6 in green, and its representation of nature, making her an ideal ultimate persona for whoever is most associated with the now stable feature of gardening to grow consumable items, which in a previous video I've suggested could be a school club. Whether or not that becomes true, the fact remains is that Demeter is uniquely fit to be an ultimate persona, and would perhaps be the most welcome redesign of this whole selection. Ometeotl, a supreme deity composed of both male and female parts, doesn't just serve well for a potential LGBT+ character, but for the theme of balance more broadly. I return to my 6 potential uses for the color green video, where I mentioned the potential use of the green lion of metallurgic alchemy, an alchemical symbol that represents vitriol, the natural world, or both. And as in alchemy, the hermaphrodite, the union between the male and female, is considered the perfect being. This makes this Aztec deity an ideal ultimate persona for a game that will likely tread the difficult path of actually explaining the nuances of the highly fetishized neutral alignment. There are plenty of personas that P Studio and the outsourced work to make the spin-off seem to gravitate towards when making new personas for new characters, with two of the most common being Tsukuyomi and Susanoo. And even outside of Persona, the latter is also one of the most recurring demons in the series to have a prominent role, not just limited to being the ultimate persona of Yosuke and Yusuke, but is frequently a prominent story-relevant boss within the series and spin-offs, as well as the true identity of Aogami in SMT5. As such, it feels right to give him a mention and to use this as an opportunity to highlight another associated deity in Amaterasu. As while Susanoo and Tsukuyomi, her siblings who like her were born when Izanagi cleansed himself of the impurities of Yomi, are frequently personas, Amaterasu is not. She has appeared as a shadow and equipable persona, but by contrast to her siblings' frequent and prominent roles in mainline or associated material, Amaterasu thus far has only been a persona once, as the ultimate of Yukiko in Persona 4, and might I add with a very underwhelming design when compared to Konohana Sakuya, and any story significance in other games is limited to being in side quests if at all. An interesting parallel given that Tsukuyomi tends to only appear as a major figure in the narrative and seldom in side quests if at all. Matter of fact, Amaterasu doesn't even appear physically in Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. It's only alluded to that Tao Isanokami holds her knowledge in a side quest, and this was in spite of early leaks that claimed that she would have a more prominent role as one of the possible gods whose knowledge Yoko held. Amaterasu could be the final persona of the Yukiko or An of P6, given the trend of one glass cannon magic user being very complementary to the Persona series, and with Amaterasu being Yukiko's persona in P4 as I already mentioned. With some representation given to their heavenly rivals, let us quickly shift gears and give a spot on this list to the earthbound Kunitsukami. If you have played Devil Summoner Raido Kuzunoha vs. the Soulless Army, then you'd know that the conflict between the gods or kami of heaven, the Amatsukami, and the kami of the earth, the Kunitsukami, are central to that game's themes and plot, as the conflict is the motivation behind the soul-powered Army Corps creation. And though I'll try to keep this video spoiler-free of that game, I am going to go with a demon that had a prominent role in said game, Hitokoto Nushi, the one who utters both good and ill within his words, which makes him doubly fitting for a balanced Persona game as well. Never mind that his design in mainline tends to be this amalgamation of leaves, and that in the Soulless Army his boss fight involves actually changing the composition of these leaves to mimic other demons, which opens up a lot of interesting potential for this to be the persona of a wildcard, or around someone's power to mimic a wildcard to some extent. This as a possibility is really interesting as a potential anti-hero, but honestly just take the design philosophy of building a persona based on someone's interpretation of the natural world, and you have a winning thematic aesthetic, especially if this belongs to a persona user with an interest in outdoor activities such as hiking or mountain climbing, as this is a mountain kami. And my penultimate choice for this list is Cernunnos, the horned god of neo-paganism, a status which could relate back to the dynamic of the horned god and the serpent of SMT5, if the developers want to add one extra Law vs. Chaos reference in the personas themselves. However, for my purposes, I'm going to argue him as a neutrally aligned persona, with a heavier emphasis on the natural world specifically. Cernunnos has appeared pretty consistently as Chaos across the series, which could actually have the potential of showcasing the dynamic of the horns themselves, as they can represent both the demonic and the divine, which makes them an aesthetic ideal for a neutral persona game in my opinion. And if you don't believe me, then I point again to 5 Vengeance, where the horned god was Law. His creation was the system that governed creation within the context of that game's plot. As such, Cernunnos' horns upon a persona can represent either or, and given that neutrality is an alignment that the developers have often struggled to articulate as a faction or side, this makes the daunting task of representing both coherently, yet not at the cost of excluding Chaos or Law, but finding a balance extremely important in ways both major and minor, and a set of horns could even work to have one represent Law and the other Chaos. Furthermore, Cernunnos is often depicted with horned snakes, which again relate back to the dynamic of the horned god and the serpent god, the very dynamic that informed the chaos and law of SMT5. Few other demons are as readily fitting yet obscure within the series itself, given that Cernunnos hasn't actually appeared in 3D quite yet, making a Persona debut all the more enticing and memorable for all the right reasons to represent the alignment most in need of subtext and nuance. Finally, and as I mentioned in my 6 potential uses for the color green video, in Scottish mythology, green is used to represent the Doina Shi, the old gods of the land and beings associated with them such as the Kushi, their hunting dogs who accompany them upon the wild hunt. As such, it feels only right to have at least one of the Doina Shi as a personal persona for a green Persona game. And I do believe that I have found the right one to accomplish this goal with Ermed. Now, the Doina Shi aren't exactly the most popular or easily researchable of all ancient myths. Oftentimes they are conflated with wider Celtic mythology rather than the region-specific spiritualism of Old Scotland, and to a lesser extent neighbouring regions in Ireland, Wales, and England. While Celtic is a far more broader pre-Christian denomination that stretches further inwards than is typically associated to outsiders of said regions. Now, the cultural, historic, and spiritual diversification and context of these regions is obviously quite complex, but long story short, the Doina Shi are the descendants of the Tuatha De Danann, a tribe of gods who came from afar and ousted the Fomorians in Old Ireland. They are called Old Gods as they are from a pre-Christian Scotland, which became highly Christian when the Romans came, especially at the borders between Scotland and England. It's obviously a bit more complex than this, but the point that I'm trying to give context for is that similar to other major religions like the Aztecs and Greeks, is that different regions have variations with regards to the canon of their deities. For instance, in some of the lesser-known Greek myths, Persephone and Demeter's roles as mother and daughter are reversed, and Aphrodite can just as much be the daughter of Zeus as she is the daughter of Zeus's grandfather Ouranos after he's castrated by his son Kronos. The same rings true in the pre-Christian United Kingdom, so bear this in mind as Ermed can either be a Doina Shi or Tuatha De Danann, depending on the region and source. However, consistently she is a goddess of healing and herbs. According to legend, all herbs with healing properties originate from the body of Ermed's brother Miak, who was slain by their jealous father. Ermed was the one who gathered, studied, and organized these herbs, leading her father to lash out and scatter them, leaving the knowledge to be a secret known only to her alone, with humanity having long since forgotten. This could make for a really interesting healing ultimate persona, who could help to cure any and all ailments, given that they've seen new life with the introduction of technical damage, and thus having a persona be readily available to counter ailments is something that should be very useful, especially when paired with greater healing and some buffs. Maybe even have a trait to gather up and find some rare seeds to grow healing items while in the party to relate back to mythology. And that's the video. Once again, this was the second in a two-parter of sorts, with the link to part 1 being available through the description and icon now. I'd appreciate it if you watched it as well if you enjoyed this video. I don't have much of an outro this week beyond that, so I'll just leave with the usual recommendations on screen now. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and would like to see more in this vein. Comment what you'd think would be a good persona, initial, ultimate, or even third tier, which I kinda skipped over, in the comments section below, and I'll see you next week.